Henry Ford owned a plantation down in Savannah, a little outside of Savannah. And when he was down one time for a visit and he was beginning to create the Model Ts, he actually thought that this might be a good material to stuff the seats of the Model Ts with. Well, it kind of worked pretty well as long as the material that it was stuffed into was leather. But then some mattress manufacturers got the thought, well, if it's good for seats, it'll be good for mattresses. So they began stuffing mattresses with it, and he decided after a little bit of, they got feedback from their customers that they were suffering bites at night. And so you've heard the saying, don't let the bed bugs bite. Well, that comes from the mattress stuffing that's attributable to Henry Ford discovering it as a stuffing for his Model T seats.
So today we're going to meet Rich and Todd, who are the historians with the Hilton Head History Tours, and they're going to give us such a great insight about the rich culture that this island is all about. So let's go meet them. And I would like to introduce you to Todd Crawford and Rich Thomas, who are historians and are expert tour guides for today, and I'm very excited to meet you gentlemen.
I hope we can live up to the expectations.
Thank you,
Kathryn.
Kathryn.
And I just want to point out the bus. We have the Hilton Head History Tour bus. So when you see this around town, you know these gentlemen are at the helm. So today we're having our history lesson, which I told everybody earlier on. And so what people don't realize in Hilton Head Island, that we think of golf, we think of beach, we think of families and all that stuff, but there's a rich history that you're going to share with us. And when I moved here from 2 years ago from Montreal, I didn't realize how much depth we have. So today we're going to unfold and discover that. So as we are here right now, we're at the Coastal Discovery Museum, and this is the honey horn. So there is some significance to this. So Rich, I'm going to let you start off and tell me what is important about the honey horn.
Okay, Kathryn, I'd be happy to. Honey Horn Plantation is actually one of the plantations that existed on the island prior to the Civil War, and then going back prior to the Revolutionary War. There were approximately 23 on the island prior to the Revolution and 24 prior to the Civil War. This one was settled by a man named Hanahan, who came from Ireland originally, and when he got here, he gave the plantation his own name, Hanahan Plantation. And a lot of people believe that the name Honeyhorn has come from kind of a lazy pronunciation of the name Hanahan. For me, that's a little bit of a stretch. I'm not sure if that's exactly where it came from, but we'll accept that as a derivation.
So I have a question for you. Rich, you're going to take us on a little tour in a second, but as we start our show, give us a quick synopsis about where are we going. We have 4 stops that we have planned, correct? And what do you, Todd? What do you think?
We're going to go over to Green Shell Park, which dates back about 3,500 years BC, and go to what's called an Indian shell ring. We'll be able to see a large portion of that wall that was built originally back all the way to 3,500 years BC and used all the way up until just prior to the European colonization. And we will try to cover 5,000 years of history in less than 10 minutes, which is not always the easiest thing to do. We're going to head over to Zion Chapel of East Cemetery and discuss some of the founders of the island. Actually, one of our earliest founders, Captain Jack Stoney, may or may not be buried in one of the sarcophaguses there with his son, maybe or maybe not. He was actually a privateer, which is just a pirate with a license. And so we'll discuss a little bit of his history. We'll see the Baynard Mausoleum ruins, which for the longest time we thought was one of the oldest or the only standing buildings on the island left over. But and that's something that's interesting we like to point out, is that our history and our relearning of our history is constant. We're always learning new things that we have forgotten and been lost. And so that's kind of a fascinating thing for Rich and I to both do.
So Rich, I'm going to take you and we're going to have a nice tour over here at the Honey Horn.
Okay, great. Let's go.
As we stop under this beautiful tree, you can see the moss, right? And I think there's a story behind this. This is something I didn't know when I first arrived. Can you tell us a little bit about the moss? Because it's a good thing and there's something funny about it.
Sure. Well, it's called Spanish moss, but it's neither Spanish nor is it moss. And the name Spanish moss actually comes from a centuries-old fight between the French and the Spanish about it. And the French were the first to coin the name Spanish beard because they thought it looked like the beards of the conquistadors that came over here. Well, the conquistadors took offense at that, and then they began to call it French fluff. And so for a long time, the fight went back and forth, but the name that history has adopted for it is Spanish moss. So I guess the French kind of won that argument. But it's an air plant. It's kind of a relative of the orchid family, and it draws its nutrients from the air. And Henry Ford owned a plantation down in Savannah, a little outside of Savannah. And when he was down one time for a visit and he was beginning to create the Model Ts, he actually thought that this might be a good material to stuff the seats of the Model Ts with. Well, it kind of worked pretty well as long as the material that it was stuffed into was leather. But then some mattress manufacturers got the thought, well, if it's good for seats, it'll be good for mattresses. So they began stuffing mattresses with it, and decided after a little bit of, they got feedback from their customers that they were suffering bites at night. And so you've heard the saying, don't let the bed bugs bite. Well, that comes from the mattress stuffing that's attributable to Henry Ford discovering it as a stuffing for his Model T seats.
And that's interesting information, because the other thing I remember, one time I went to pull it down, because no one said, don't do that because the chiggers are going to come on top of you and you're going to it. So, but then anyway, a little bit of Southern charm with a little Southern history.
Sure, sure. They're not that numerous. I mean, there wouldn't be that many if we pulled down a piece of that and put it around your neck, but it's not something you want to do.
One too many.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep going. So tell me about this door, because this is a special house.
It is. In fact, it's one of the few buildings on Hilton Head Island that survived the decade of the 1890s. In the decade of the 1890s, we had 6 hurricanes that hit Hilton Head. 2 of them were devastating. One was a hurricane of 1893, and that killed about 3,000 people in the Port Royal Sound area, and it also left most of Hilton Head Island under up to about 20 feet of water. Then there was one in 1898, and that one wasn't quite as bad in terms of the storm surge, but what happened with it was it knocked down a lot of trees, and those trees acted as battering rams, and many of the buildings that were there on the island, built out of wood on brick pier foundations, were simply wiped off the face of Hilton Head Island. So we don't have too much here that actually predates, in terms of structures, the Civil War. This building is one of the 4 or 5 that predate that war. And it's called the Graham House, and that's after the name of the people who bought it from the Hanahan family after the Hanahans had moved on. And it burned down, the old Hanahan house burned down, and the Grahams, who were from inland from here, town today named Ridgeland, they actually built the house in 1859, 2 years prior to the Civil War. And this was a relatively typical but fairly elegant country plantation house for the period. And this was the rear of the house, and that was the rear door of the house. A center hallway led through to French doors on the other side that opened out onto a large patio.
Right.
And then there was a way when the summer air would heat the air over the land, and that would rise, cooler air would start to come in off the water. So it was able to be trapped through this center hallway. They cracked the back door, opened the front doors, and you had a kind of a natural air conditioning that would flow through the house at times like that. But this was where the family would live when they were here. Most of the time they didn't live on Hilton Head Island. They would have lived in Savannah or in Beaufort or maybe even Charleston or possibly Atlanta, and then come really only in the times of planting and harvesting, so in the spring and in the fall.
So, one thing that's interesting is about how people don't know that they had no bridges here. They had a bridge the first time in 1956, I believe.
That's
so everybody
correct.
had to come by water.
That's
and if
right.
you're thinking about the 17, 18, 1900s here, everybody came by boat. And what made this house unique is that it had the water, which creek is this one now?
This is it's today called Jarvis Creek.
Jarvis Creek, okay.
Back in the days prior to the Civil War, it was called Crooked Creek.
Okay.
And Crooked Creek is a body of water that even at this location, way back out near its end, it's still deep enough to get a fairly good sized boat up that could have been used at the dock to load bales of cotton onto that would have then been able to go right out the creek, across the Calabogie Sound and over to the markets in Savannah. Because this creek goes out for about 2 miles and empties into the Calabogie Sound. And before the causeway was built, that's out there about 300 yards now, you had a view from this dock that took you all the way down to the Calabogie Sound. It was beautiful, one of the prettiest views on the island. But now all you can see is that concrete causeway that's about a couple hundred yards out. One other thing about the area that we're in right now, this building that's over behind you, Kathryn, is a modern building, but it's in roughly the location where the kitchen for the Graham house, for the main plantation house, would have been.
Right.
Because they would have had external kitchens at the time, and most people think it's because of the fear of fire. But the fear really was that the people who lived in the houses, the genteel people in those days, didn't like to be bothered with the smell of food being prepared. So they had the kitchens that were outdoor kitchens.
I always thought it was the fire.
Everyone does. Everyone does.
thought
But
that.
no, it was this thing, no, you don't want to have that smell.
I can understand that though, but depending on, so this is interesting. What's in front of us? We have a memorial.
This is really a garden that celebrates a number of the figures of Hilton Head's history, I should say. And it is a kind of a memorial garden, but there are no remains anywhere near here. So these are purely
Right.
a testament to different people from the island's past. Go ahead.
You know, you get a sense of the plantation though. You could see the architecture and you could see this beautiful sort of existence, the moss trees and all this wonderful wonderment here, you know?
Yeah, and when in the day when this was used as a plantation, today it functions as a museum.
Right.
But in those days, this would have been a beautiful lawn that would have come from formal English boxwood gardens that were out back of the patio. And then that lawn led to the dock. And today's dock that you can kind of see through the trees there is actually in the location that the dock was for the plantation house at the time.
Yeah.
And this is kind of known as Hilton Head's Hall of Fame. That's what they call it. But notable people from our past.
Very much. But I do want to point out also that the Coastal Discovery Museum is right over there. And that is such a great place, rich in history and teaching us about the wildlife, the eco center of the island, perfect for kids. Anybody who's visiting the island, we have our sports, but there's deep education here. And you can see a couple of reptiles and all kinds of reptiles.
You bet, you bet.
So we want to also tell you about the Coastal Discovery Museum as well.
Yeah, its mission is it's helping people appreciate the Lowcountry, but it does it through educating people about natural history, cultural history, wildlife, environmental history, all of those things about Hilton Head Island, and it's really a treasure.
That's terrific. Well, Rich, I think we have a great time here.
Okay.
Let's get on the bus and we'll go to our next destination.
We'll move along.
As we're traveling to our next destination, the Zion Cemetery, we are going to talk about some of the trade and the mercantile that we had here on the island, because I just didn't really know what there's plentiful of. I mean, we have the ship building.
We do.
We have fine cotton.
We do.
We have gourmet rice.
We do, but very little of it on the island, but yes, we had some.
So tell us about that, because when it started, I mean, we're talking about 400 years we've been having this.
So so the colony of South Carolina starts in 1670, and that's with the founding of a British and Barbadian colony up in Charleston. And that was supposed to be settled here on Hilton Head Island after William Hilton's discovery in 1663 and his recommendation that this be the location for the English colony. But for a number of reasons, some things happened, and then the fleet that came in was separated, and one of them survived the crossing and had to find its way up the coast, hopefully to go to Virginia. And they ended up going into the harbor of Charleston to avoid a storm, and they found a place there that they settled. But anyway, that was 1670. And the first crop that was introduced into South Carolina was rice. And that rice crop was grown primarily in the freshwater portions of the rivers up to about 30 miles inland from the coast. But prior to rice as an agricultural product of South Carolina, or of the province of Carolina before there was a North and a South, it was really cattle. And there were dairy cattle and beef cattle. Beef was the primary export product of the province of Carolina, and most of that went down to the British Islands in the West Indies. And the beef was just pickled in brine and shipped in barrels down to the West Indies. And then really up until the Revolutionary War, the main crop was indigo. And indigo comes in around 1740 or so. It was introduced very quickly throughout the Sea Islands because of the knowledge and generosity of a woman named Eliza Lucas Pinckney, who was the first person to successfully plant a crop of indigo in South Carolina.
You know, and that's actually on Pinckney Island. And I remember reading the history on that, and it was, to my understanding, it was a very fine cotton, and this is actually exported to Europe.
So before she grew cotton, they grew indigo.
Yeah.
And this indigo is the blue dye, very much like the dye in your skirt,
Right.
blue jeans. And that crop was the crop that made the planters on the Sea Islands in Carolina, as opposed to the rice growers, made them fabulously wealthy. And that lasted really up until the Revolution. But in the Revolutionary War, obviously, the British embargoed American goods when we won the war, and essentially that indigo market crashed overnight. And that left about 5 years of complete lawlessness in this area, when highwaymen and robbers were going around and finding people who had anything left from their prior wealth and taking that. And then it was 1790 that a planter from Edisto Island, a guy named William Elliott, ended up growing the first commercially viable crop of Sea Island cotton.
Okay.
And that was here on Hilton Head at his plantation Myrtle Bank, which is out in Hilton Head Plantation near Dolphin Head. That whole area out of Dolphin Head is that plantation. And then Sea Island cotton goes on to become the primary economic crop in South Carolina. Again, the source of phenomenal wealth for the planters on the Sea Islands. And it couldn't be grown upland. It wasn't
Right.
able to be grown inland at all. And so, again, these people became very wealthy prior to the Civil War. And on the eve of the Civil War, 9 of the 12 richest men in America were planters of Sea Island cotton, either from Georgia or South Carolina. And 6 of them were from South Carolina. So that's kind of a quickie on the agricultural history. The manufacturing history on Hilton Head has really two primary parts. One of them was the shipbuilding industry. And the shipbuilding industry starts in about 1740, or 1737 was probably the establishment of the first shipyard.
Right.
And the shipyards were built in the Broad Creek area, right in the kind of middle of the island. Obviously on the deep water bends of Broad Creek, where it was fairly easy to get a ship into deep water quickly from the skids that were built on the land. And they used live oak, and live oak was used for the keels and for the ribs of the ship. One interesting thing about live oak is that you couldn't build a complete ship of live oak because it's so dense, that it's so heavy that it doesn't float, that it would actually sink.
And we just arrived at the Green Shell Park, and this is really a significant area on the island because we have the Gullah, the Geechee community, as well as some Indian information from what, 3,500 years ago.
Sure. Yep.
And so what else are you going to share with us?
Well, right now we're going to walk out a couple hundred yards to the observation point looking over Skull Creek. We're not going to linger here in this cemetery. This is still an actively used cemetery by the people that are called the Gullah and then the Geechee. The Gullah people have retained their own culture.
Why don't we start walking?
They're left over from the original freedmen. They're the people that have remained after the Civil War and retained their culture. We believe that the term Gullah, and this is what we believe, comes from the fact that a majority of those people that were enslaved originally came from a region in Western Africa called Angola. And so as they were being brought into the slave markets, they would be asked where they came from, and they would say Angola, Angola. And so that somehow turned into Gullah. As far as Geechee goes, we don't have any clue. Most of the Geechee people, as they refer to themselves, are down south of us, closer to Brunswick and into the northern Florida region.
So the Geechee is more of a territory area type of thing?
That's a good way of saying it. Yeah, that's
so
a good way.
So it's south of what, Savannah?
Yes, south of Savannah to Brunswick is where you'll find more of the people that identify with the Geechee culture.
Right.
But often you'll hear the terms put together, i.e. Gullah Geechee. This is the back edge. And this wall right here, it's kind of hard to see from this view, so we'll go out and look at a more cutout of it.
So it looks like a knoll, just to let everybody see. It's a natural wall. It looks like almost like a dome type of thing, right? Would you say that? A dune?
Yeah, that's a good explanation, but it actually, it would have been about 10 to 12 feet high. And what it is it's shells, specifically oysters, mussels, clams, and some mud snails that are packed on top of each other over that period of about 3,500 years up until the present, so 3,500 years ago. What happens is that originally the people that are coming to this area, the indigenous peoples, the Indians, as we grew up with that term, they were nomadic. And as they're traveling from their summertime regions, which were located more in the northern part of the state, they're using the waterways of the Ace Basin, the Ashepoo, the Coosawhatchee, the Combahee, the Edisto, and they're actually floating down from the upstate on those rivers and making their homes here in the winter where there's an abundance of shellfish. And they do this for several thousand years. They travel back and forth. What we also start to see as we dig through the walls itself is the pottery that they've been making change and become much finer and more delicate closer into the present that we get. And this pottery is one of the things we believe that takes them from being nomadic and into actually living here in a full-time manner. Now, as they're living here, they're creating this structure with the shells that are left over from their meals.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so what's the significance of this? Because there's...
Well, the significance is simply the fact that and we'll be able to see in a moment, that we have this structure here that is so old and predates pretty much everything else that you can think of in the area. But the interesting fact of it is how long it was being used over and over, and that we believe the use of it changed. So in the beginning, we think it was more like a garbage depot. The people that were living here, we refer to them as the Roundhouse Indians. They built their houses in the round, mm-hmm. A lot like a teepee with a flat top. Yes. And they also built their villages in a round manner as well. And so each one of them would have their own little garbage depot outside of their tent, their teepee, their roundhouse. And eventually those all connected with the leftovers of the shellfish and actually rise up and connect to each other. So as far as we just walked through, the edge of the wall goes that way, all the way around. And these shell rings are only found in a few places in the world. They're found in northwestern South America. They're found in Japan, on a couple of the islands there, and then here in the southeast. Depending on where you are in the southeast, they change a little bit. This one is the only one we know of that actually has a half little shell loop in the middle as well, a little semicircle that we just walked next to. So the wall itself, if you want to get a really good view of it, what it would have looked like is down here.
Okay, that's what I'm looking for, because what you were showing me before was covered with leaves.
Yes. Well,
so I could see the shape of it, but I couldn't see what it actually was made of. Well, so if we look down here, these are all the shells, and so this is a collection of 3,500 years.
And that would have been bigger than a football field, encompassing this entire area. There's another one not far away down the creek that is actually the only one we know of in the world that was 2 circles. There is no astrological significance for these, even though they do kind of remind you of the pyramids being in Egypt and in Central America. They didn't line them up with the stars. No, they weren't figuring that out. There was also no beheadings going on.
They didn't have a labyrinth or anything.
No, there was no labyrinth. It was, what we believe is that it was originally used as the garbage site, sort of, and then later turned into a ceremonial area. The village is right there. Possibly, we only find one bird species, the little green heron, and you know how many birds we have here.
Right.
Alligator is found in there. There's only one species of fish that's found as well. It's a freshwater perch, even though we know they're out getting the shellfish in the salt water constantly. So we kind of have to assume that was some sort of celebratory food for them. We're looking over the Skull Creek right now, and you can sort of see the color of the water. What we're actually seeing is chlorophyll being emitted during the photosynthesis process from the plankton that's in the water. So the sun is reflecting that. But as you watch the waterways, very often you'll see sort of a brown, poolish move back through that tide as well, and that's actually the siltiness that's being moved, the dirt.
Right.
There is very much a symbiotic relationship going on with the tide, with the grass that's out there, which is called Spartina grass. Those two, the grass is actually capturing little grains of that sand and helping to create these little islands. As the water comes in and rushes over, oysters, which are actually flip-flop sexes every other year. One year they're a male, the next year they're a female.
I didn't know that.
And when they meet up in the open water, the spawn and the egg that is, they will float around on the tide for a few days until they'll secrete a very strong cement-like substance, usually to another oyster bar. Now the tide is high enough right now that I can't actually see the oysters, the live oysters, but if the tide was low, and we'd have the second highest tidal fluctuations on the eastern seaboard here, ours is about a 6 to 8 foot swing. The Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia, theirs is about a 20-foot swing every 6 hours. So when the water's lower, you can see all the oysters, and they are dark and black and look like sort of like muddy. And this is what they look like when they've been cleaned and washed and eaten. And the sand that's on the other side is where the clams like to live. If you see the little sandbar over there. And then there's actually mussels that live in colonies in the grass. So right here is that food source for those
Oysters,
Indians.
clams,
Oysters, clams,
and mussels.
right there.
I think and the people could go out and harvest them, or do they need a license?
You need a license, and there are specific commercial areas, but you just need a regular fishing license in order to harvest. There are strict regulations as to how many you can take, though.
Okay.
So check with the regulations on that. We don't want anybody to get in any trouble.
That's one thing we have, great culinary here as well. And what else can we talk about while we're at this park before we go to the next one?
Oh, well, we could talk for hours, so you'll have to keep me short.
We had so much history to talk about that we needed to create part 2 of this episode. Please join us next week with Rich and Todd of the Hilton Head History Tours, where we'll continue our conversation about pirates. Little did we know that they had a lot of law and order on their ships. And changing history is Mitchellville, where it was the first community governed by free black slaves. And that is where it all began in Mitchellville. So join us next Tuesday on our YouTube with Coastal with Kathryn. We'll see you then.